Hello, guys. Welcome again to my channel, Psicolosofia. Here I talk about psychology, science, and philosophy. And today I'm with a very special guest directly from California, United States, and one of the greatest psychoanalysis critics of all time, Frederick Crews. Thank you for coming today. I'm so happy to have you here. I'm your host, Clarice Ferreira, directly from Brazil. And before we start our interview, I just want to make a quick announcement. I want to tell you guys that the paper about psychoanalysis scientific status was just published. The link will be in the description below. It tries to make a reevaluation of the psychoanalytic doctrine using a new demarcation proposal, Sven of Hanson's, instead of using Karl Popper's. And as you might have noticed, today we are going to talk about psychoanalysis and about Crews' works on it. Thank you once again for coming. I'm so glad you are here with us. How are you feeling today?
I'm fine, and how are you?
I'm fine, and I'm very happy.
Good.
So, to start, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your career and about the trajectory that made you start researching psychoanalysis, that made you start criticizing it. What led you to this path?
All right, well, let me just summarize my career. I graduated from Yale and got a PhD from Princeton and came out here to California to teach at the University of California, Berkeley, which I did for 36 years. I retired in 1994 when I was chairman of the English department because I was teaching literature all that time. I've written about 14 books. I've edited 10 or so others. And these books have been well received. I've won some prizes, both from institutions and committees for awards. I'm an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In the middle of my career, I took an interest in Sigmund Freud. That was back in the 1960s. And I could go into that for you in some detail if you want to explain why I first became a Freudian, a rather loyal Freudian, and then gradually lost faith in psychoanalysis. I even lost interest in it for quite a while. But then around 1980, I resumed my interest in a negative vein and have been a critic of the dogma ever since. So do you want me to go into that?
Of course, I'm very interested. If you could start saying what led you to be interested in psychoanalysis, first in a positive way, I guess, right?
Yeah.
If you could tell us.
Well, in general terms, back in the 1960s, psychoanalysis was at its high point in the United States. This was for many reasons, including the fact that the leaders of the psychoanalytic movement, people like Anna Freud and Ernst Kress, had moved to England and America, and psychoanalysis had become, to a large extent, an English language thing. And there was a tremendous prestige attached to this discipline. If you went to psychology departments or psychiatry departments, you would find that they were totally dominated by Freudians. It was just assumed that psychology and Freudianism were pretty much the same thing. And in the intellectual world, the people that I most admired, people who have been described under the name the New York intellectuals, were all Freudians. I mean, all of them. They had been Marxists in the 1930s, Trotskyists in particular, but with their disillusionment with communism, they turned inward toward the mind, and Freudian psychology simply was the mind as far as they were concerned. So these were the influences that I was subjected to as I aspired to be a young intellectual myself. And of course I became a Freudian. There would be no doubt about it. But I tried to do something further. I tried to introduce Freudian ideas into the study of literature, and very few people were doing that at that time. So in the mid-60s, I was working on a book on the American author Nathaniel Hawthorne from a Freudian point of view. And I happened to be at a think tank at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford at the time. And it was presumed, and I had a couple of fellowships that were paying for this. It was presumed at the time that I would be deepening my acquaintance with psychoanalytic thought. But I bumped into some social scientists there who disagreed with me and who put me on to some reading that was contrary to everything I'd read before. The writers included Karl Popper, with whom you're very familiar, Ernest Nagel, Sidney Hook, among others. And they all said the same thing about psychoanalysis. They said, this is a self-validating system. This is a circular system. Now, what did they mean by that? They meant that if you apply psychoanalytic principles to your observations, you will of course come out with psychoanalytic answers. But this is to be distinguished sharply from actually investigating the world or investigating a work of literature in particular. Psychoanalysis contains clauses which defend it from refutation. For example, the idea of resistance and the idea of repression can be used to take any criticism of psychoanalysis and turn it on its head. If you say that Freud is wrong about something, well, you're simply resisting. This is a psychological mechanism. Maybe you secretly agree with Freud, but you don't even know it. You've repressed it. Furthermore, the practice of psychoanalysis is supposed to be the means by which psychoanalytic knowledge is obtained. In other words, psychoanalytic knowledge is clinical in origin. But if you look at the clinical situation in a typical psychoanalytic session, it's a very unequal kind of dialogue in which one party is much more dominant than the other. And essentially what's going on is the imparting of the therapist's views to the patient. Then if the patient, after months or years, comes to agree with the therapist assumes that he or she was right all along. And typically the therapist will write papers with his or her new psychoanalytic ideas based on the success of the treatments. But were the treatments a success, or was the patient simply convinced by pressure that was exerted on the patient? So for these reasons and many, many others, including specific statements by Freud to the effect that he used unconscious evidence to reach his conclusions, I decided very slowly that psychoanalysis was not a means of knowledge, not a reliable avenue toward knowledge. And I'd like to say that I changed my mind immediately when I learned this stuff, but that's not the way it happens. You have confirmation bias, you have your personal pride. It took me a number of years to realize completely that I had to abandon this system of thought. And that's what I did around 1970. But by 1980, something else interesting had happened, and that is that a certain kind of Freudianism imported from France was becoming popular in the humanities in American universities, including my own university. So then I was faced with an interesting problem. I had gone through a rather embarrassing reevaluation of my own principles and had sworn off using a method of thought which my colleagues were now starting to employ for their own purposes. So what could I do? I couldn't do anything but try to alert people to what I'd gone through to spare them from the same embarrassing process. So I began writing about the logical flaws of psychoanalysis. And I did that in 1980. I continued to do so. No one paid much attention until 1993. And that was the year that I published an article in the New York Review of Books called The Unknown Freud, which inspired more controversy than any article that had ever appeared in that magazine since its founding in 1963. And I followed it up a year later with an article about the so-called recovered memory movement, which I regarded as an outgrowth of a certain kind of Freudian thought. So with these two articles, the psychoanalysts became very aware of me, and they gradually decided that I was the most dangerous person alive. They flattered me, as you, Clarice, have flattered me by saying what a great critic I am. In fact, all I ever did was to try to summarize a tradition of independent scholarship, Freud scholarship, that from the 1970s until right now has taken a very different view of Freud from the view that he himself took of his work and his followers took of his work. So yes, I've been very controversial, and I'm still controversial. Among the various books that I've written, the most ambitious and also the most recent is a book called Freud, The Making of an Illusion. It's almost 700 pages long. It took me 11 years to write it, from ages 74 to 85. It was published in 2017. And if I would like to be remembered for anything, it's that book, because it presents a completely new vision of Freud's development, of how he went from a rather conventional medical education in a great university to becoming the center of a cult surrounding himself, a cult and a pseudoscience. So that's my trajectory in brief. It probably doesn't sound very brief, but I should probably stop there.
Would you say it was hard for you to change your mind about it? You said it took some years.
It was very embarrassing. It seemed to me that if you're going to be a university professor, and if you aspire to be an intellectual, you have to follow the best guidance to truth that you can. If you find that you yourself have been essentially fooled into accepting a dogma which does not have scientific backing, and yet it purports to be a science, purports to be a system of psychology, you ultimately have no choice but to give it up and to face the embarrassment, which is what I did. Now, the Freudians, of course, have said, oh, Crews used to love Freud, but he probably had a very bad psychoanalytic experience. And Freud is his father figure. I'm sure he hates his father. And if he hates his father, then he hates Freud too. He's working all this out in print. This is all just autobiographical. Crews is writing about himself. I understand from you that people in Brazil are saying something similar. But in fact, over the years, in many publications, I've made it very clear that I don't regard Freud's personal life or his peculiarities of personality as having anything to do with the validity or invalidity of psychoanalysis. These questions have to be answered on their empirical merits and their logical merits. And that's what I've done over and over, including in the recent book.
Yes. I'm also curious to hear more from you about how do you conduct your research to write the books you wrote on psychoanalysis?
Lots and lots of reading. And I had the honor of being acquainted with some of the very best critics of Freud, people like Adolf Grunbaum, Frank Chaffee, Frank Soloway, Mikhail Bork-Jakobson, Peter Swales. These are all friends of mine. So personal acquaintance and the miracle of email have helped a lot. But in this most recent book, I did research that really doesn't appear in any other biography of Freud. The letters that Freud wrote during his engagement to Martha Bernays from 1882 to 1886, when they were mostly apart, are extremely valuable. They're just full of interesting information. They just tell you a lot about the way Freud thought, and also, by the way, about the drug he was taking at the time, which was cocaine. My book goes into their relationship extensively and shows how his thinking about, not about psychoanalysis, but about medical matters in general was evolving during this period. These letters were in the American Library of Congress, and nobody had really bothered to make use of them. Of course, they were embargoed, they were tabooed for many years. But by the time I wrote my book, they were not. Anybody could have done this research. So there's no miracle of research in my work. There's just a lot of labor, really.
I see. We are going to talk more about your book later, but I wanted to ask you about your previous books on psychoanalysis too. Can you tell us more about them? What were they about? How did you conduct the research on them previously?
Yeah.
What were your goals?
Of course, the first book that I wrote involving psychoanalysis is one that I hope nobody ever reads again, because I disagree with it. And that was the book published in 1996 about Nathaniel Hawthorne, called The Sins of the Fathers, Hawthorne's Psychological Themes. Unfortunately, the book was quite influential in academic circles. And when in 1980, the University of California Press asked for my permission to reprint that book, I said, I'll let you reprint it if you allow me to add an afterword explaining why you shouldn't believe what it says. And that's what I did. So if you read that portion of the book, you can kind of get over the argument of the rest of the book. Very unusual circumstance. But these articles that I wrote for the New York Review of Books in 1993 and 94 brought forth so much correspondence, so much criticism which I answered at length in the pages of the magazine, that the New York Review decided to put out a book containing my articles, plus most of the letters and all of my replies to the letters that were published. That book is called The Memory Wars, Freud's Legacy in Dispute. And anyone who wants a quick view of the way I regard psychoanalysis can go to that book. And you wouldn't have to read the 700 pages of my most recent book. Another book that I did that I think would be of interest to people who care about psychoanalysis is an edited book called Unauthorized Freud, Doubters Confront a Legend. This book is an anthology of writings by the independent critics that I mentioned earlier. If anyone thinks that opposition to psychoanalysis is a personal matter with me, they can get over that idea by reading this book, because there's a range of, 10 or 12 very prominent and very brilliant critics who are approaching Freud from different points of view, but all converging on the idea that basically, as a science, there's nothing left of psychoanalysis. So that's one thing. Then I published several collections of essays of my own, because I wrote for the New York Review of Books over a period of 53 years. And the pieces that I wrote about psychoanalysis most of them are collected in the most recent of those books. It was published in 2006, called Follies of the Wise. And again, there are specific critiques of Freud and psychoanalysis in there, along with a lot of other stuff about culture and literature. And then finally, there's the book that I just mentioned, which is a biographical study, not really an analysis of psychoanalytic propositions, but an inquiry into how Freud got to be Freud.
Talking about Freud, considering all the research you've done until now, I wanted to ask you, what do you think about Freud's honesty? Do you believe he was honest in the way he described his clinical cases?
I think a more interesting question would be, did Freud ever tell the truth about anything? If so, I don't know what it is. You see, Freud was in the business of selling his psychotherapy as the superior one. There were plenty of other therapists around with other ideas. But Freud insisted that his therapy was best because it produced the most cures. If you had any kind of neurosis like obsessive compulsive neurosis or depression or anxiety, psychoanalysis was the remedy for it, and the others simply didn't work. He said that over and over again. He said that to the public. He did not say it to his psychoanalytic colleagues because they knew it was a lie. But as far as the public was concerned, Freud was a magical healer. Really, he had brought a gift, like the gift of Prometheus bringing fire to the world. Neurosis had been a mystery until Freud came along, and now everybody can get well with psychoanalysis. Well, this is just pure baloney. Freud, to our knowledge, to the best of our knowledge, never cured anyone of anything, nothing. He hinted in his famous case histories that he had cured some of these people. Others he had really didn't quite go that far. But if we read his letters, and particularly his letters to his very best friend, Wilhelm Fliess, whom he knew intimately from 1887 until the turn of the century, we find Freud complaining over and over again that people are walking out of his office. They are laughing at him. They are regarding him as a fool. And he says in so many words to Fliess, I have never cured anybody of anything. He says so in his letters. All you have to do is, maybe there's an example of Freud telling the truth, but he tells it only privately to his friend. As far as the public is concerned, he is a great healer. Now, if you move forward, way forward to the 1930s, when Freud was a very famous man and his reputation was not in any danger at all, he just casually said in one paper for the public, I have never been a therapeutic enthusiast. What does that mean? It means he's been lying the whole time. He never cured anyone. So, yes, he also lied about his own findings. He claimed to have discovered the unconscious. He claimed to have discovered repression. He claimed to have discovered such laws as that if you suffer from hysteria, that means that you have repressed an incident in your deep childhood, probably of sexual abuse. Or later he changed his mind and said, well, no, it's not sexual abuse. It's the sexual desires that you had for your parent of the opposite sex. It's the Oedipus complex. He claimed that he had proven this, but of course he hadn't. He just simply made it up. And if you study the phases of Freud's career, you can see very clearly that he gives up one method, such as hypnosis, for another, such as his so-called pressure method, for another, such as orthodox psychoanalysis. And in each case, he claims that he is making wonderful cures. But then why does he give up his method? Why does he change his method? It's because he wasn't having any success. It's rather obvious. And at each point, he claims in his papers a certain number of cures. He says, I cured 12 people of hysteria by showing them that they had been sexually molested in their childhood. And then he says a little later, well, it was 18 people. Well, it wasn't anybody at all, because if you read his letters to Fliess at the same time, he's saying, my office is empty. He says, it's like being in the middle of a forest, being in my office. Nobody's there. So yeah, Freud lied constantly. Now, of course, in the 20th century, he became what he always had wanted to be, which was a great philosopher, great thinker. I think his ideas were completely nuts. He was crazy, talking about the origin of humankind, the Oedipus complex that went into effect as soon as we came down from the trees, the band of sons wanting to kill the father so they could have sex with the mother. This was all completely crazy stuff, but that's what he really wanted from the beginning. He told Fliess, I always wanted to be a philosopher. Now I'm a philosopher, People listen to me because they think I'm a healer. And because of my healing, they'll take my word for what I say about other topics, such as art, history, music, literature, whatever. He couldn't stop pontificating, always applying psychoanalytic ideas to culture, not truly investigating culture, but rather using psychoanalysis as a template to place over culture so that everything would always look Freudian. And that's what he became most famous for. But it's really just persisting in the confirmation bias with which he started.
Very interesting. But can you tell us more about, for example, some of his specific clinical cases, some of the people he tried to treat? How did he really conduct his therapy with those people, and how did he distort his findings?
Yeah. Well, you know, Freud wrote papers advising psychoanalysts to be very patient, very Socratic, listen carefully, don't form conclusions until you're sure that you are right. But his own practice was exactly the opposite. When Freud got a theory, he would apply it to the next patient that he saw, and he would not give up. If the patient disagreed with him, well, that of course was resistance, repression, denial, and so on. He was a terrible therapist because he was a bully. And, you know, don't take my word for it. People like, say, Janet Malcolm, who died recently, but who had, 40 or 50 years of Freudian therapy herself, really. She described Freud as a colossal bully in the consulting room. He wanted to overpower his patients. And in particular, he wanted to overpower their repression. In other words, he had to get them to admit that their conception of themselves was wrong, that only he knew what was truly the matter with them. So he would badger them, he would harass them until either they would agree with him and accept a whole Freudian worldview, or they would simply walk out on him, which most of them did in the 19th century. But I'm going to tell you about, I think, the most significant patient of Freud's. And that is the one called Dora. That wasn't her actual name. The analysis occurred in 1900, but the paper describing it wasn't published until 1905. Dora was a girl whose father was having a sexual relationship outside his marriage with another woman. And the husband of that woman had his eye on Dora at the age of 13. Freud said she was 14 at the time. Actually, she was 13. So Dora was very upset by this tangled relationship, two adulterous relationships in her family. And she was angry with her father. So her father took her to Freud and said, hey, she's a hysteric, cure her of hysteria. And in particular, cure her of the idea that I'm committing adultery with this other woman, which he was doing. And Freud said, oh, okay, I'll do that. So he took Dora into psychoanalysis and he tried to convince her that her father was right and that she was wrong, okay? Now, among the things that Dora told Freud was the following. She said one day, but she was about 18 at the time of the analysis. One day when she was 13, this man whose wife had been having an affair with Dora's father took her into his office and grabbed her, pulled down the shades, gave her a big kiss, and she wrestled her way away from him and ran down the stairs and escaped. Freud says in his Dora paper, this was a sign of hysteria. He says, if a girl of 14 rejects a sexual advance, clearly she's a hysteric. I mean, what more really do you need to know about Freud? And we could stop right here. But Freud went on to harangue Dora and try to convince her of all kinds of things. Not only was she secretly in love with the man who was trying to rape her, she was also in love with the man's wife because she was a lesbian too. And furthermore, she was in love with her father. As a matter of fact, she wanted to commit oral sex on her father, and that's why she had problems with her throat. She had a cough. Well, the cough meant oral sex. It was perfectly obvious. So after about 11 weeks of this, Dora said, hey, I've had enough. You are the problem. And she walked out on Freud. And Freud was very vengeful. And he ends his case history with the bitter denunciation of Dora, who was not patient enough to endure the wonderful psychoanalysis that he had offered her. This ought to be one of the great scandals in the history of psychotherapy. But if you look at the psychoanalytic institutes around the world for training new analysts, you'll find that they teach the Dora paper. They think it's wonderful. And by the way, it contains wonderful dream analyses too, absolutely wacky dream analyses of Dora's dreams. Really, instead of reading Freud's papers about the Oedipus complex and so on, I really encourage people just to read the paper about Dora. If you read it carefully, you will get over Freud in a big hurry.
Thank you for commenting on the Dora. It's really an absurd case.
Yeah.
But
maybe I should interrupt and mention one other case, the
yes.
Wolfman. You know about the Wolfman?
Yes, tell us.
Yeah, the Wolfman was one of the richest men in Ukraine, I think. At the time of the First World War, Freud advised him not to worry about the war. His money would be just fine. Of course, it wasn't. He became completely broke. But he had some psychological problems. He had an obsessive compulsive disorder. And Freud analyzed him completely without any success at all. But he wrote it up as a success. He wrote it up as a cure. That was typical of Freud. But the Wolfman, who got that name because he had a famous dream of a bunch of wolves sitting on trees outside his window. And Freud thought, oh yes, that proves that he overheard his parents having sex when he was a little boy. Perfectly obvious, right? The Wolfman wasn't cured. So various other psychoanalysts had a crack at the Wolfman. Some famous people took him on, off and on for a period. Now I forget the exact number of years, but it was something like 60 years. And at the end of his life, the Wolfman was interviewed by an Austrian journalist who asked him about his experiences with psychoanalysis. And he said, it's been a complete waste of time, a complete waste of time. And all of the top analysts knew this, but you know what they did? They established a fund to keep the Wolfman from starving to death, but also to keep him from talking, to keep him from telling anybody about his experiences with psychoanalysis. It was only this interviewer at the end of his life who got him to tell the truth. And he said, and I quote, Freud is dead and I am the same as ever. Another one of Freud's big successes.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I think most people don't even know that those stories did not happen in the way Freud described it, because here in Brazil, I think we still have a lot to catch on the critics. There's a paper, one of the few papers talking about the critics of psychoanalysis. The other is my paper. But there's another paper that questions exactly this. Why isn't anything on the literature published that talks about the critics on psychoanalysis? They're basically not discussing it. So I guess this is very important. People have to know because those clinical cases are used as the big proof that psychoanalysis works, used by teachers, used by great names in psychoanalysis.
Yeah. You know, Clarice, let me talk about the experience of psychoanalysis in the United States from the 1950s on, just very briefly, because you have told me that something similar seems to be happening or about to happen in Brazil. There seems to be a new enthusiasm for psychoanalysis. I would think that people in Brazil might be interested to know what the experience has been here. Maybe our experience could spare you some of what might be coming down the line in Brazil. In the 1950s and 60s, as I said before, psychoanalysis reigned supreme in the US. But then something interesting happened. In the 1950s, psychotropic drugs were discovered. That is, their application to psychoses was discovered. Now, I'm not saying that these very powerful drugs, like thorazine, for example, are good to use, especially on neurotics. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that psychiatrists found in the 1950s that drugs had a very dramatic effect on the symptoms, even of people who were severely insane. And what that did was to lead psychiatrists to the assumption that perhaps there was a neurochemical basis for mental problems that was more significant than the emotional and ideational basis that psychoanalysis was positing. So that led gradually to an abandonment of the whole idea that maybe inquiring into the childhood vicissitudes of a patient was really the best way of going about things. So psychoanalysis started to fade. At the same time, in the university departments of psychology, people were finding that they couldn't do research with psychoanalytic concepts. And as you know, in the universities, research is everything. If you don't publish significant research, you're not going to be promoted. So what was the problem? The problem was that when psychologists tried to experiment with psychoanalytic concepts, they found that the concepts didn't actually mean anything. If you have a concept like the Oedipus complex, or the castration complex, or penis envy, for example, the concept, in order to be amenable to experimentation, has to have clear consequences attached to it. In other words, you have to be able to recognize its effects. If you can't recognize its effects, you can't control any variables, you can't reach any conclusions. But it was found that these concepts are understood in a different way by different analysts, and they're understood in different ways at different times. Even the same person will use them in different ways in two different sentences. So how can they possibly be used in experimentation? So gradually, the psychologists simply abandoned psychoanalytic concepts altogether. You will not find psychoanalysis being used in experimentation in any American university, none whatsoever now. It's all completely over.
And if you ask them, what do they usually say about psychoanalysis? How do they view psychoanalysis today?
I'll tell you, they don't view it at all. They ignore it. They absolutely ignore it. There is a compilation of references in psychology that was published in 1997 that shows what psychologists were talking about over a given period. It contains 1,314 references. There's one to Freud, exactly one. I haven't read it, so I don't know what it says, but I'm sure it's not very complimentary. So look, these things were happening, but then in the world of therapy, people were doing comparative tests of therapeutic efficacy, effectiveness. The psychoanalysts, as we all know, charge more per session than any other therapists, and they subject their patients to more sessions than any other therapist. So that in
For
fact,
years, right?
years
Decades.
is sometimes decades really. You know why? Because the emotional entanglement that people get with their psychotherapist, with their psychoanalyst, means that they find that they can't abandon it. And so even though they're not being cured of anything, they now have a new relationship in their lives, which becomes an obsession. So they just keep it up. Well, the tests that were done to compare therapeutic outcomes discovered that there was no advantage whatsoever to psychoanalytic outcomes. That isn't to say that some people didn't end a psychoanalysis feeling that they'd gotten something out of it. On the contrary, many people did. But if you look at the time spent and the money spent, then you would have to say that for similar outcomes, psychoanalysis is the least efficient therapy ever invented. And people started to realize that. And you know, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, whose founder, Aaron Beck, just died a couple of weeks ago at the age of 100, a great man, who, by the way, started as a psychoanalyst and then saw the light. People like Beck realized that you don't need to spend years in therapy examining your attitude toward your mother. What you need to do is to change your attitude toward yourself. And if you're having trouble eating, or if you're having trouble flying in a plane or crossing a bridge, we can do something about that. Let's talk about it. Let's take you on that bridge. Let's take you on that plane. And let's get the whole thing over with in a matter of weeks. And once people started realizing this, psychoanalysis as a prestigious therapy simply started to fade, and it's been fading ever since.
Yeah, I hope that with the new movement we are having here, we get to discuss those things more often. I guess we still have a lot to catch on, even on our education. We still talk very little about science, or if we talk in the universities, usually it's against it. They say science is positivistic, science is not something that can help you, it's not something that aims to help patients, it only serves capitalism, that sort of stuff. We still have to battle this kind of discourse, but I think we are advancing slowly, but advancing. I hope one day we can be on the same shoes as you are now.
Good. Well, you're doing your part.
We talked a bit about Freud, but I wanted to ask you about other great names in psychoanalysis. I wanted to ask you about, for example, Jacques Lacan or Melanie Klein. What do you think about them? What do you think about the works they've done? If you ever wrote something about them?
I've written a little bit about Lacan, and I've certainly read Lacan and Melanie Klein. These people differ sharply with Freud on certain points. And of course, what we want to know is, what is the basis for the difference? What is the observational basis for the difference? We find that Freud never really inferred his concepts from his experience with his patients. Rather, he got the concepts from one place or another and then tried to impose them on his patients. So is it really different with Lacan? Is it different with Melanie Klein? Well, Lacan, who, by the way, by the end of his life was completely mad. But let's not think about the very end. Lacan talks about the mirror stage of development. Okay? We would like to ask Lacan, what are the observations that you and others have made that lead you to believe there is such a thing as the mirror stage? Did you discover this? When did you discover it? How did you discover it? How has it been validated by others? Is this now commonly accepted? And the answer is, oh, I don't deal with such matters. This is all trivial. I get these ideas out of my head. They're just plain true, that's all. Which means that Lacan and Freud are in the same epistemic boat, a ship of fools. Now, what does Melanie Klein say? She says, you know, very small infants go through a paranoid phase in which they want to tear their mother's breast apart. Oh, really? Tell us how you learned that. What's the evidence for it? Did the babies tell you about it? Did you see them ripping their mother's breast apart? No, no, no. These are just ideas I have, and they're true because I say so. This is the basis of most of the schools of psychoanalysis which fight bitterly against one another. And an outsider looks at them and says, how can I choose between these two schools? Is Freud right about childhood, or is Melanie Klein right, or is Jacques Lacan right? Where do I go to adjudicate between these? And the answer is, no, no, no. This is all about belief. These people are gurus. These are authorities. You believe in the guru that you like the best, and you take his or her ideas. So it's basically a kind of religious thing. So now I admit there are psychoanalysts who are not as daffy as Melanie Klein and Jacques Lacan. For example, D.W. Winnicott says a lot of reasonable things. Karen Horney says a lot of reasonable things. It's perfectly possible to be a sane person and be a psychoanalyst. Indeed, it's possible to be a psychoanalyst and to throw over almost everything that Freud ever said. A lot of psychoanalysts are doing this right now. They're not imposing Freudian ideas on their patients. They're treating their patients like people who have a problem that might be investigated in a friendly way. Insofar as they're doing that, they're not being at all Freudian. So now the question is this: why did they continue to defend Freud? And I'll tell you the answer. Let's think about two pills for asthma or for high blood pressure. One is a generic pill, costs 25 cents. The other is a brand name pill, it costs $50. The people who are selling the brand name pill have a big problem. Nobody's going to want to pay $50 when they can get the same thing for 25 cents. But what if the pharmaceutical company says, you must buy our brand because we're ever so trustworthy and we've done so many wonderful things in the past. You will feel better with our brand because it gives you confidence that you are reliably getting the very top best medicine. Well, that is the role that Freud plays in psychoanalysis today. It's not that the analysts are orthodox Freudians. I'm not sure there's a single orthodox Freudian left in the whole world. It's that they need Freud in order to justify charging more money for more time than any other kind of therapy. So when people like me say Freud was a charlatan, which is what he was, it endangers their livelihood. That's what they're worried about. They're not worried about scientific principles. They're worried about people going to some style of therapy which is more targeted to the specific problem they have and which will deal with that problem in an efficient manner.
Thank you. There's something else I wanted to ask you about, but first I need to put you and who is watching in context. Recently, there has been a polemic between a psychoanalysis teacher, Professor Christian Dunker, and proponents of the evidence-based psychology movement, including me. Dunker has been trying to defend psychoanalysis from its critics and to find flaws in the evidence-based movement. And there are two things he says that I guess would be interesting to bring to you so we can talk about it. The first thing I wanted to ask you is about the memory wars movement. Dunker says that psychoanalysis has nothing to do with it, and that none of the therapists involved in the incident were psychoanalysts. I wanted to ask you about that. What was the memory wars movement about? And is that true that psychoanalysis has nothing to do with it? What would you say?
Okay. The memory wars, actually, it's the title of my book, and that book became the name that is always used now for the movement in the 1980s and 90s, largely by women, not entirely by women, but largely by women who were radical feminists, who were very angry at psychoanalysis for having such a negative attitude toward reports of incest and other forms of sexual abuse. Because, as you're aware, Freud, with his so-called mature doctrine, believed that most cases of reported incest were really just fantasized by women who really wanted to have sex with their fathers. That was the Oedipus complex for women. And therefore, their complaints that they had been sexually abused could be dismissed. In fact, there's a famous psychoanalytic textbook with an index that says, incest, see Oedipus complex. In other words, if your patient complains of incest, well, surely she's just suffering from fantasies about her father. That was the Freudian view. These feminists were very angry about that, and their anger was entirely justified. But they went to the extent, unfortunately, of trying to convince their patients that they had been sexually abused when the patients did not report sexual abuse. So it was exactly the opposite of the previous cases. In doing so, they drew into effect Freud's theory of repressed memory. Freud believed until approximately 1897 that if a patient shows hysterical symptoms, she has been sexually abused. And she will, of course, deny it because this abuse has been repressed. But if through psychoanalytic therapy, you can convince her that she was molested, maybe you can bring forward the memory of that event. And if you bring forward the memory, she will be cured of her hysteria. He didn't succeed in doing it with a single patient. And eventually he just gave up the idea that these sexual molestations were the cause of hysteria, and he put the Oedipus complex in their place. But for a certain period of Freud's career, he was practicing exactly the kind of therapy that feminists and psychotherapists were doing in the 80s and 90s. Now, so psychoanalytic ideas were most certainly involved in this movement, but psychoanalysts themselves were involved in it because many psychoanalysts are themselves radical feminists. And I could prove it to you by citing a psychoanalytic journal called Psychoanalytic Dialogues. There's an issue from 1996. It happens to have an essay by me in it because they unwisely invited me to contribute, and I most certainly did. But it's all about recovered memory psychoanalysis. That's what it's about. And there are two feminist psychoanalysts who published papers in there, and then there are commentaries by various people, including me. And my own paper cites about a dozen psychoanalysts at that time in the 1990s practicing recovered memory therapy in exactly the way that the non-analysts were. So the answer is yes, this has been a very Freudian thing. It's more similar to the early Freud than to the mature Freud, But in both phases, there's Freud's concept of repressed memory, which, by the way, has received no definitive scientific support whatsoever. So independent psychologists are not aware of a single case in the history of the world of Freudian repression.
Thank you. There's a second thing he mentions. It's when he talks about specifically your latest book, Freud, The Making of an Illusion, which we were talking earlier. He says that you wrote this book to say that psychoanalysis is not a science because Freud cheated on his wife with his sister-in-law. He really says that. And I wanted to know, what would be your reply to Dunker's accusation regarding your book? Is that why you think psychoanalysis is not a science? What would you say to him?
Well, first of all, Freud's cheating on his wife is of great biographical interest. Most people now believe that it really did happen. And I'm quite sure it did happen. For one thing, his sister-in-law told Carl Jung about it in 1907. She was very upset. She was having an affair with Freud right there in his own apartment. And she didn't like it. She didn't know how to get out of it. But there's lots of other evidence, and the evidence is in my book. And what's especially interesting about it from a biographical point of view is that Freud regarded sex with one's sister-in-law as incest. And Freud prided himself on being the man who had overturned the incest taboo through psychoanalysis, but he also thought he was overturning it in his private life. So that's extremely interesting biographically. What does this have to do with the validation of psychoanalytic ideas? Absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. And you have told me previously about this Mr. Dunker, who makes this claim that my book says psychoanalysis is invalid because Freud had an affair with his sister-in-law. I would like to make an offer to Mr. Dunker. I would like to give him $1 million. I'll get on a plane and fly down to Brazil and hand him $1 million if he can find one sentence in that book or in any of my other writings that says what he claims to be the thesis of the book. And if he cannot do that, then the man is a liar. And I would be very grateful if he would come forward to the public and explain that indeed he is a liar.
And that's not the first time he does this. When he recorded his first video answering to us, he mentioned and he threatened another professor here that is from the evidence-based psychology movement. And he said that author wrote in his book about the memory wars, but there was nothing there. We searched the whole book and nothing, absolutely nothing. And he is now doing the same with us. He's saying that we are Popperians, that we defend science in a strict view, not in a broad view, just like you saw Hanson's proposal, that we believe that only experiments are scientific, so it's not something that happened only one time, you know?
Uh-huh. Well, what can I say? If he's saying these things about me, what is he saying about others?
Yeah.
I think you can judge for yourself.
Okay, but I asked you about almost everything I had planned for today, but I wanted to leave it open to you if you have something else you wanted to mention, something you want to say for the people who are trying to start this movement here, if you have any advice, if there's something I didn't ask but you wanted to talk about.
All right. I think in the very broadest terms, what has been happening in both psychiatry and psychology over recent decades is a realization that whatever we say about the mind has to be compatible with what we know about the brain, okay? it doesn't mean that you can look into the brain and see the concepts that you want to use in psychotherapy or even in psychological research. But what it does mean is that the mind is a function of the brain. And therefore, if the structure of the brain proves incompatible with some of our assertions about the mind, that should worry us. That should make us question those assertions. The very broadest premise of psychoanalysis is what might be called the psychodynamic point of view, whereby the human mind is conceived to be divided against itself. You know, Freud's ideas of the ego, the id, and the superego suggest that anything we do or say in life is a compromise between contending forces within our minds, okay? So, and that's why he had the famous statement that the ego is not master in its own house. Now, if we look at the brain from a Freudian point of view, we would expect to find it structured in a way that is compatible with this statement. Is the brain arrayed against itself? We know that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere have very different functions, but we also know that they cooperate with each other. The mind is an incredibly efficient machine. It is not arrayed against itself. And if you look at this from a Darwinian point of view, of course, we did not get where we are through millions of years of evolution by not being able to act in a way that is in our best interest. That's exactly what the brain is meant to do. So the entire point of view behind psychoanalysis, never mind the specific propositions about the castration complex and so on, the entire point of view should be brought into question. And whatever we want to say about the mind from now on, it should be compatible with what we learn about the brain. Not that we now know everything worth knowing about the brain, but let's look to the future. Let's look to real investigation, and let's make our psychology compatible with whatever the best knowledge is that comes out in the future.
Thank you, Frederick Crews. Thank you a lot for coming today. Thank you a lot for accepting my invite.
Well,
It was a pleasure.
It's my pleasure, and I congratulate you on your heroic work.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. You will always be welcome here. And
great.
That's it. Best wishes to you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.